Gresham College presents Thinking Theologically About Modern Art, Part 6, Discussion, with Lord Harries and Professor Ben Quash.
Rather than Ben and I hogging this whole session, there's a slightly different format to involve other people more. I'm just going to set out briefly one issue which has arisen in my mind as a result of hearing these talks and open up, see whether anybody else has got any comment on that. Then Ben is going to simply share with us one issue which has arisen in his mind, see whether anybody got any comment. Then I thought we might give some of the other speakers an opportunity to do the same if they would like to do so. But of course there'll be opportunity for everybody who wants to reflect on anything. Now the issue that I want to begin by raising is one which has long been on my mind ever since I first started thinking about these issues, and it arose right in the beginning of Ben's lecture on the desublimation of modern art, when he quoted the lecture, I think, from War Studies about how photos of the attack on Baghdad had made it look kind of beautiful, and she thought that we needed to get away from that in order to show the real devastation that war brings about. And I'm sure that's absolutely right in principle. But it seems to me that the problem is that once you start to bring art into it, whether you like it or not, in some sense, you're going to, in the wider sense of the word, commas, beautify things. Because art by its nature is bounded, and once you bound something, and you make it art, you put in something which corresponds to the medieval balance, symmetry, and clarity, which are certain aspects of beauty, not all beauty, but certain aspects of beauty. And therefore, your attempt to show the total devastation of something actually is somehow made consolatory. And I cannot help bringing to mind, for example, that very famous remark when the full horrors of the Holocaust came to light, that after Auschwitz there can be no more poetry, because poetry, of course, is consolatory. And for me, it comes to a kind of focus in the challenge with the crucifixion. The crucifixion, the most cruel form of torture that's ever been devised by human beings. Yet we've made it a beautiful work of art. What on earth are we doing? How can we resolve this? And even a famous picture like Guernica, which was meant to show the horrors of war. Actually, because it's a work of art, it has some of those elements of balance, form, elegance about it in some sense. It is consolatory. And there is a fundamental problem here. It's one actually I tried to address in the last chapter of my book on art and the beauty of God, which I'm not going to repeat here. But has anybody got any thoughts about that really fundamental difficulty? Somebody has. Yes, good. There's a microphone coming. Yeah.
Some years ago, I commissioned, or tried to commission, from art in churches, the Stations of the Cross, to be done as realistically and as challengingly as the artist could do, and as contemporary as possible. And in the doing of that, he failed to do it because he felt that the content was, in a sense, too strong. But one reflected in the process of that one way to make the Stations of the Cross acceptable was to put them into a golden frame. That in some sense maintained a sort of numinousness about it, that allowed them to be challenging and incarnational, but still made them safe and able to be viewed. Now, if you go to St. John on Bethnal Green, you'll see another artist's attempt to do the Stations of the Cross. Whether or not that has succeeded in being conducive to worship or just frightening is up to the viewer.
Thank you for that, but though I still think it leaves us with the fundamental problem. I don't think it has resolved. My own view, as I sketched out in The Art and Beauty of God, is that I think this issue is only resolvable ultimately in terms of Christian theology, and that the cross is inseparable from the resurrection. I take an extreme, totally unbelievable point of view that all art is ultimately grounded in the cross and the resurrection of Christ, but that would be difficult to argue in the modern world. Another reaction to it from, yeah.
Coming back to to try to answer your question, Bishop, and come back to the question of the God-shaped hole. I wonder whether the move by artists to express divine or religious concepts in very abstract terms nowadays doesn't reflect a wider dilemma facing us all, and particularly people who are Christians and interested in the church, and that is, if I'm right, increasing uncertainty about fundamental Christian beliefs, which I think permeates our society nowadays, with relatively few people going to church, and even divisions amongst devout church-going people about the inherent and deep meanings associated with Christianity. Whether it is, Bishop Jenkin talking about the resurrection being conjuring tricks with bones, whether it's, whether the sun goes round the earth or the earth goes round the sun, or whether even in our present day, whether two people who are of the same sex have the right to be married in church just as anybody else, when there is so much now division amongst on all those levels, which go to my mind, go to the very heart of what we believe. It's inevitable almost, and probably a good thing. Certainly an intriguing and delightful thing to see so much of this art, whether it's windows or in sculptures or in pews and concrete work, expressed in much more abstract terms, within and from which we gain ourselves whatever it is we want to gain from it, without being told that this is right or wrong.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, of course, as has been brought out a number of times, that there is no, what Peter Fuller, the art critic, called no symbolic order in our time, no big story, so that people are very ill-informed and ignorant when they go into churches. That is one fundamental problem. It's obviously related also to the lack of belief that you point out. There's an even older and much more difficult problem, that is that how in a finite, limited, mortal world do you actually indicate something beyond the world? How can you do that visually and iconographically? I mean, that is the problem, which Roger was indicating, one of the aspects that he and artists like him have to wrestle with. I think I don't know how we. I'll just take one more, and then we'll open up with other people. With Ben next, yes.
It's really a reflection on the boundedness you talked about, the fact that something's set within a frame.
Yeah.
It occurs to me, and it's come through several times during the day, that there's actually two ways at least in which a particular work of art may come out of its frame. First, when a subsequent artist actually derives from the original work of art a response, an interpretation that actually makes the original work of art a living thing. And there's a whole community of discourse arises there. The same thing happens within Scripture, where the prophets are picked up in the New Testament and so on. It happens with poetry and music and novels and so on. And the other is the way that the picture or the sculpture or whatever it is comes out of its boundedness in the response that's actually made by those who engage with it, so that art is not simply the original works of art, it's actually the responses that are made, both by other artists and
I like that very much, and I'm very fond of the modern translation of the Greek word poema, which St. Paul uses. I love the modern translation of that as "we are God's work of art." And you could. So, Ben, you share a thought with us and see with what was asked.
Well, I've continued to think about the question at the beginning of the day on context, and Francis's paper in particular showed us a lot of the context in which the experience of particular works of art happens. And so did Jonathan, actually, in church contexts. So one of the things that I'd like to put out is the importance of thinking about the relationship between architecture and some of the works of art that we've been looking at. It's particularly near the top of my mind because I spent yesterday at a small symposium with a mixture of architects and architectural theorists. Roger Scruton was there, and a very interesting architect and writer about architecture called Christopher Alexander. I don't know if any of you know his work, who has a very strong account of the need for the spiritual in architecture. And pretty much everybody there was extremely rude about modernism in architecture, and in particular the fact that these were not humane spaces, that generally modern architecture is not particularly interested in traditional ways of making a humane environment. And the little details that they picked up on, which they thought did contribute to a humane environment, include things like mouldings, which were relentlessly attacked in modernism, and the fact that sort of certain delicate mouldings, as one person put it yesterday, show that a building is not just about the materials from which it's built, but, for example, the light, which is captured by mouldings, and the way that light and darkness can become articulate in the mouldings of a piece of architecture, and so on. So the emphasis of this rather sort of reactionary group of people, with whom I thoroughly enjoyed being, I have to say, was the importance of dwelling places, places you could really be at home in, and, as Scruton put it, rest, places where you can rest. So I want to ask something about whether we expect significantly different things from architecture and from painting, for example, or other forms of visual art, and if we do, why? Or whether we should be holding the exercise of the making of visual art to some of the same standards that we would expect from architecture, an architecture that we could rest in and feel at home with. Would that be inevitably a betrayal of the seriousness and intensity of art in service of comfiness, or not? That's a question for you. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
Well, if I could tie that in with Bishop Richard's initial comments, I actually didn't find the images put up, was it by George Pattison, of the Nash's "We Are Making a New World," of the stumps of trees in the war-torn landscape, and thinking also of his Menin Road and other iconic images from the First World War, which really bring home what happened at that time in a way that perhaps black and white photographs don't do, that they're not consolatory, that they do more than that. They are bounded, yes, but precisely because they are bounded and have formulated something about that, in both cases first-hand experience, I'm thinking also of Nevinson's, that they do seem to catch something that endures, that has a duration, and therefore forms part of our historical knowledge of that period. So in that case, I don't think we're necessarily resting in them. If I think even when Nevinson moved away from his more so-called semi-vorticist style, which so suited the war pictures, ironically, and reverted to a realist style in order to portray, I forget the famous name of it, the Paths of Glory, I think the title is. You see soldiers lying face down dead in the mud. That was, of course, censored. And when he exhibited again, he got a huge strip of paper and wrote censored on it and pasted it over the painting and exhibited it. So the fact that it was actually rejected as something that was unacceptable confirms the sense that although they were trying to paint the unpaintable, as indeed anyone who tries to approach the Holocaust in the terms of a memorial event, whether it's an architectural memorial or a painting or a poem, whatever, is facing the impossible, the incommunicable. Nevertheless, these things do have value and aren't always consolatory.
Just a thought on the gold frame. I mean, that's one sort of boundary or border around an image of horror. But actually, there's an entirely different sort of border or context around it, which is the activity that goes on in a church. You know, the people who might be doing the Stations of the Cross or whatever. And it seems to me that if you're going to confront somebody with an image of profound horror, the humane thing to do is also give them something to do in response to it, or help them with their response to it. And this, in a sense, is simply to echo what Richard has said, that the practices of Christian liturgy, and particularly the remembrance of the cross in the context of the Eucharist, are a set of practices that can conceivably help one then to a context for an image of horror that can give one something to do, having seen it, because otherwise one's completely disabled by it.
But that requires a confident church.
Yeah.
Or a confident group of participants.
Yes.
What I'm worried about is that, in fact, we are going to be moving into an age where there is a lack of confidence in the church, and the iconoclasts, whether they, however they enact their action, you know, their iconoclasms or whatever. That we will be moving into a period where the whole is filled with something less than God.
It's almost the opposite of iconoclasm, isn't it? The icons will become the reassurance, and the stuff that is hard to give form and boundary to is the stuff that will get broken up or attacked. You know. George, can I just invite George's response before? Yeah. Do you want to take the podium? And then we can you can then become the next.
Yeah, it was just going back to the point that was brought up again by Lord Harries about the shock and awe, as it were, and then touched on again by Francis. And of course, we always see things in context, and sometimes we, both in general and perhaps in this room today, talk about our reactions to pictures and images as if they're without context, which they never are. And so thinking of the Paul Nash, and of course for people who are familiar with the Victorian Edwardian iconography of war, often translated into a medieval environment and with knights in shining armour, those kinds of images really did shock people because that wasn't what they thought they ought to be seeing. And of course it's become increasingly difficult, I think, for visual art to have that kind of effect. Yet with regard to Adorno's saying about the Holocaust, I believe recently George Steiner has said with regard to the Holocaust that there are only two cultural monuments that really matter, and that's Claude Lanzmann's compilation of survivors' memoirs, Shoah, the film, and the poetry of Paul Celan. And of course the poetry of Paul Celan, extremely difficult though it is in a way revelatory, I think. But for me, paradoxically, but this depends on context. I mean, the only works of visual art that really do anything to, as it were, cut through the crap and the frame are paradoxically images I've seen both in the Ghetto Museum in Prague and in the Siege of Leningrad Museum in St. Petersburg, are children's drawings, which may be of people playing in a field under sunshine or doing stuff with cows or whatever else happens in children's drawings. In the one case, drawings produced by children in Theresienstadt concentration camp, and in the other by children in this city that was besieged for 3 years, where 1 million people died, a very largely forgotten event of history outside Russia, I think. And you see underneath the picture, this little page, it's a new year, maybe we can look forward to a jolly summer. By Oleg, age 9, Oleg was killed in an artillery barrage on March the 15th, or whatever, and, that tells you what it's about in a way. And partly for this reason, I don't watch any war films relating to the present conflicts in Iraq or Afghanistan, because I believe that these films are largely geared to making us at home believe we know what's going on. And of course we don't in that sense, and we like to. It was very interesting for me to reflect, of course, that for my parents' generation, perhaps for some people here who really did live through the Second World War, those films did not come with the kind of realism that contemporary war films do. These days war films have to have limbs being blown off and one sees the torn arteries and the rest of it and so on, whereas in the 1950s, for films that were being produced for people who had lived through these things, didn't actually need to see those kind of images, apart from the fact that there wasn't the technological sophistication to enable filmmakers to do it. I think actually if they'd wanted to do it, they could have, because film's been pretty clever all the way through with the power of illusion. So in some ways, context is all, I think, and feeds into how we react to things. And I think there are realities, including the crucifixion, which 9 times out of 10 visual images will take us so far and won't get us all the way. And of course, even ones at work can become routinized. I guess a lot of us now have seen Grunewald's crucifixion innumerable times and will refer to it as an image that, as it were, tears the veil. But once you've seen it 100 times, maybe it's difficult for it to do that. But I remember teaching a class in Theology of Art in Denmark and, as it were, suddenly showing that image to a class, none of whom had seen it before, and there was literally from all these, and they're older than our students, they're all mostly in their 20s, going for ordination, quite mature people, and they were shocked by that image, which cut right across what people expect from an ecclesiastical representation of it. So context is not all, but all these images come to us with a certain context, both our own social context and the context of the other pictures that we've seen, what we know about the events. And as Lord Harries was saying, that clearly someone looking at a crucifixion with a theological or a faith position that stands in the tension of crucifixion, resurrection, is going to interpret it differently from someone who doesn't.
Do you want to raise any other points out of your reflections?
Well, I was very interested in what Roger said at the end, which, having flagged his conservative credentials through his talk, he suddenly revealed his modernism in his last line, where he said, "I paint what I like." I don't think many 16th or 17th century painters would have said, "I paint what I like." That in a sense, but also I thought his talk illustrated beautifully, really, the way in which the 3 dimensions of time play into both the production and the reception of art, and from my particular biased point of view, perfectly reflect Heidegger's view as to the way in which these 3 dimensions interrelate with the primacy on the future, that we always approach the world with a certain end for something. We've come today to hear some lectures, to learn something, to find something out, and that expectation, in a sense, whether it's fulfilled, disappointed, or whatever, conditions everything we happen. So, Roger starts to study art or to paint, starts to do a new work, and yet that throws him back to the tradition. How can one orientate oneself in relation to this new thing? And of course, it's interesting, even breakthrough modern artists like Manet and Picasso are constantly in dialogue with the past and recycling the work of previous artists. And so this dialogue between future and past then comes down to the present. And, well, what is it I've got to do? What is it I'm going to do now? And this thing of presentness. Here is a job that has to be done and produced. And it seems to me that that's, in some sense, more that creative moment is more prevalent than, as it were, concerns with certain ideas of beauty. And what matters at that point is really responsibility, and perhaps that the artist is prepared to take the responsibility that goes with producing the work and to identify themselves as an artist in a sense with it. And sometimes that might mean at a later point in their career disowning it and tearing it up or putting it on the fire and saying, no, that's not what we should be doing. And that creativity and responsibility, I think, is, and to use a sort of very old-fashioned word, a very ennobling aspect of art, and religiously, in a sense, potentially instructive, even where the content may not be overtly religious.
What I've been thinking was actually relates in a sense to what you've been talking about, sort of consolation, because I think I wanted to sort of slightly speak up for consolation. Obviously it's true that there is false consolation, that I mean, one of the points that Jonathan Sachs makes in the book that I was mentioning is, I think it's George Steiner who talks about people consigning people to the gas chambers and then going to listen to Bach, and how difficult it is to reconcile those sort of two things, and what a sort of problem, in a sense, certainly for Steiner, that has been. What Sachs replies to that is that the search for meaning is something that defines what human beings are and what they need and what they do. And simply, I mean, what people who have been through trauma need to do is to somehow process that and to actually make sense of it in their lives. And the art that just presents you with more trauma doesn't help you to do that. Consolation is actually something a true consolation is something that we need. And the art that actually somehow can give us that is well, what we mean by grace, I suppose. So that was just my reflection on that. And how that comes is different for everyone. And so I mean, I always have thought of what I'm doing as actually having a key, as it were, which opens particular locks and doesn't open others. And I think all of us in different ways sort of have kind of keys like that. That I know my paintings may open a key for someone, for others it'll be completely useless. But that's just the way life is and the way it works. And if it can open the key for someone, then even if it's only one person, that's fine by me. So anyway, that was just my little reflection.
Francis, you want to share anything?
Just one or two things that I wanted to throw, but I wonder if I could just begin by mentioning a set of Stations of the Cross that have been made for a very tiny church on the border of Herefordshire and Wales at Discoed, which the idea for it, which was put to the vicar who accepted it, was that an artist in the area should go around with his friends and ask if they would like to take part, each one doing one of the 14 stations. And to his surprise, the people he approached readily agreed, regardless of really what their faith was or was not. And as a result of that, they put the titles of all the stations in a bowl and asked them to pull one out. And they did say, well, if you're really unhappy with what you pulled out, you can negotiate. But interestingly enough, when people pulled them out, they all felt that that had been somehow given to them, and they stayed with it. And I was fortunate to be present at an evening where they all met in a person's house after they'd all finished these pictures. I think there were only 12 of the 14 artists there. And there was sort of some buffet food for supper and so on, and we all walked around looking at them. And then each artist spoke in turn about the experience of whether it had been difficult or easy to try and find the solution and what it had meant to them. And what was interesting was, of course, that instead of having one artist doing all the Stations of the Cross, which risks for the people in the church, perhaps not being what they can respond to, there was this great variety of styles and media there, and quite some very, very original, in one or two cases, interpretations of the actual scene. And it did make for a very lively and fascinating journey, and it also made the old story come alive and suddenly seem relevant again in a fresh way, because it was interpreted through the eyes of all these very different contemporary artists. So I do think it's an extraordinary thing, and because they're non-permanent, you know, there's no need for a faculty of any sort like that, and they're not there forever, they're just there for the specific period of time. So it's a wonderful way of refreshing the passion story at that period through art. I think what I am worried about, if I may bring it up, is the need for the contemporary, partly because I teach art history in an art school, in a fine art department. I see these external examiners walking around the degree show agonizing over what is the contemporary, and presumably it changes from year to year, and it's not easy to identify. But I noticed in I think George's talk that you said our art cannot be a vehicle for timeless, eternal truths, and you went on to ask, can an art that is modern also be genuinely religious? And I suppose that I felt that there's endless more discussion perhaps to be had about this layering of time in art, and whether or not something that does fully engage with globalization, the internet, the things that are determining our life today, it risks being really fashionable, something that won't last, that won't have the duration, say, of a greater paintings, or you know, will manage to grapple with things that are important. So I think that's my only...
Would you like just to say something about the experience of teaching art history to these art students? I mean,
yes.
What's your experience of them and their understanding of art?
Well, if they're coming in as practicing fine artists, they usually have done well enough at school A level to get into a university, and they have certain skills which they've made their own, and which they hold to, cling to quite strongly. So one of the things that not myself but the fine art teachers try to do is to remove those things that they rely on and feel safe with and secure with, on sort of projects like asking them for 1 or 2 weeks to do nothing but make things with found objects or found materials, so they can't resort to these personal skills and so on. So the thing is partly a stripping down and rethinking, trying to get through. But the other thing I think is talking about, say, contemporary critical issues, alerting them to some of the debates that are going on, which have been foregrounded by some of the words used in the talks today. The disconnect, the word that you used, Ben, is something that I've heard used quite a lot recently, and it is a sort of changing atmosphere or intellectual climate, which a fine artist, I suppose, does have to at least be aware with, even if at the end they decide for good reasons to reject and to say, no, these are not the issues I want to work with. But we are all immersed in the ills. What was that wonderful quote somebody had about breathing in the, was it yours? Breathing in the germs and pleasures of society. Yes, that's right. And I think because we're living in society, it's very difficult to be free of the sicknesses of society. We are in some way implicated by them. So to totally try to turn our back on what is modern or, you know, of this moment is perhaps not the most positive way forward for the young artists. But
thank you very much. And Jonathan, have you got any reflections you would like to have on anything you've heard today? And then we're opening up to anybody else who wants to.
Yeah, just a few very brief points. One, I think, kind of spinning off of what I was talking about, is that in my thesis, I'm quite kind of resistant to the idea of the church becoming a cultural space, shall we say, a space where, you know, art is kind of flowing through its turnstiles, which, you know, is not such an unusual metaphor, since these days you have to pay to get into a cathedral, whilst the the art gallery tends to be free. And so, I have this sense, as Frederick Jameson talked about the cultural logic of late capitalism, there's this sense that the church, I think, is in danger of becoming just another kind of cultural space where we, imbibe more culture. Furthermore, kind of culture promoted as part of a cultural economy, of course. And I sort of think of the Millennium Bridge as being like this sort of umbilical cord or something of a sort of the parent to the child, and this sort of art flowing across, from one side to the other, pouring into St. Paul's Cathedral. So I suppose the point I would make, and I don't know how other people feel about this, is my feeling is that I would rather see, in a way, fewer works of art going into churches, but works that are very sensitive and very thoughtfully, worked through, rather than the cathedral becoming a place that is just a kind of rolling program of cultural events and art exhibitions. So when you have a work like Alison Watts, a single painting, sensitively placed, that for me, I think has far greater power than, say, Gloucester putting on yet another big exhibition range throughout the space. So that's one point. Another point, just coming back to something George said, talking about creativity, something that Peter Fuller also said, where he was kind of fulminating against a lack of creativity, and he talked about the art-shaped hole that very often exists within kind of contemporary art. And I must admit, I do rather kind of sympathise with that notion. I think his idea is that art has kind of disappeared and theory has kind of flowed in to take its space. Or if not theory, then, I don't know, a whole load of other stuff, which, in his view at least, doesn't really constitute art. And then the only other point I would make is that I was conscious that what I was talking about seemed in many respects to be sort of diametrically opposed to what Ben was talking about, in the sense that he was talking about incarnation and the body, and I was talking about kind of God being found in the void, or God as the void. And it then reminded me, I'd forgotten at the time, but it reminded me of kind of why I think Badiou is interesting. And it's a comment actually from Terry Eagleton in his book where he's criticising the New Atheists. And he speaks to some degree quite approvingly of Badiou's ideas. And he says this, he says, truth is what cuts against the grain of the world. And that, I feel, is what Badiou is trying to suggest. And that, to me, seems to be kind of an important idea. And so one of the other things which I'm quite supportive of is the notion of sort of temporary works within churches rather than permanent works. Not exclusively, but I think temporary works can be extremely useful in producing work potentially that kind of cuts against the grain, cuts across the grain, and allows a greater degree of risk. And I seem to recall in your most recent book, George, you mentioned something about the importance of risk in art production. And that if art does not involve some degree of risk, it becomes, I think, simply product. Is that what you said?
I think that's right, and it relates back to what I said before about the local art show. I mean, I think you can go around the art show in your church hall or wherever, and you can see something that's maybe not at a technically high level. You can somehow pick up that that person's taken that risk and really done something which connects with what I was saying about responsibility as well, and is prepared to go with it.
Yeah.
It's always very exciting when you see that, whether it's, as it were, someone who's great and famous doing it, or whether it's,
I think
next door neighbour who took art up last year.
Yeah, I think I remember reading Hans Feibusch, who, you can see his stations across just around the corner from here. His great mural, of course. And he talked about the importance of responsibility on the part of the artist, which goes along with kind of risk-taking on the part of the church. I think those are two quite well-matched, ideas, really.
Thank you very much. And now we've just got a few minutes to see who'd like to make any reflections on anything that has emerged for them from the day. There's a lady there I don't think has spoken yet.
Thank you. Thinking about the God-shaped hole, I was then trying to imagine what shape this hole would have. and creativity. And then I was thinking, well, actually, we know what the Greek gods looked like. We know what Roman gods looked like. We know what Hindu gods look like. We know what Buddha looked like. Why weren't we creative enough to create our gods, images of them? Or have we, in a way? When you go through churches and see people worshipping different saints, in a way it's the same promulgation of images, or isn't it?
Well, I think that raises a very interesting point, because in 843, when the church decided that there should be such a thing as a Christian art, the argument put forward by John of Damascus was, of course we can't depict the invisible God, of course we can't, but the invisible has become visible, the word has become flesh, and for that reason Christian art is not simply an optional extra, but it is actually fundamental to the faith. And from that, I think you might argue that whatever Jonathan has said and others said about being able to bring abstract art and other kinds of work into a cathedral and church, I entirely agree. In the end, there must be something in the cathedral, I think, which indicates the fact that the word has become flesh. And right from the origins of Christian art in the 3rd century in the catacombs, there were attempts to depict Jesus Christ, not God, and that's why Ben and I both groaned a great groan when he mentioned the Renaissance paintings of the Trinity, which are quite appalling. You wouldn't get that in Orthodoxy. It's totally unorthodox to do that kind of thing. The orthodox thing is to paint the visible become visible, Jesus Christ.
To see God in art, you have to have an inner eye, as it were. In the Bavarian Museum of Art in Munich, they have collected they have a large collection, which tells me when I visited it, or told me when I visited it, more about the pathology of the history of religion in Bavaria through the years than it necessarily did about God. So in a sense, each art form is going to have a very large percent of cultural extras one needs the inner eye to discover the godliness in some of those things. And so I'm encouraged when people say that we actually need less art of better quality in our cathedrals. And I'd be very concerned if they just became village art galleries.
Yes, would that were an easy thing to do. That the capacity to discern what is and is not simply a form of sort of cultural accretion, and what is of God is, a perennial difficulty in doctrine, let alone in art, and the inner eye has the risk of suggesting that one could actually achieve a position where one had a clear view, and I think that it's much messier than that. That, as it were, it's a perpetual and communal process of discernment, where you constantly revisit the tradition that you've inherited and seek to test it so that you can work out actually what may have been a wrong turn or a misleading lens, or that sort of thing. So it's a collective task and a very important one. And although I wouldn't want to overdraw the analogy between art and doctrinal tradition, they are both traditions and they're both vulnerable to these sorts of distortions.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.